The Old West is remembered through legends of cowboys, gunfighters, and endless frontier skies. But beneath those stories lies a far darker reality: corruption, violence, betrayal, and lives erased from memory. This was a world built on greed and survival, where myths were created to hide the truth. These are the dark secrets of the Old West you were never meant to know. Number 1. Blood money and corruption. Behind those dusty streets and saloon doors, the Old West thrived not on noble justice but on cash and covert deals. In boomtowns, the badge often marked not honor but the price one could pay. Sheriffs and marshals wound up collecting fees from businesses under the guise of protection, and constables quietly accepted bribes to ignore outlaw gangs rolling through. In places like Cochise County, that authority was literally taxed worth 10% of all proceeds from gambling, liquor, theaters, and brothels, and became a lucrative source of graft. That made the job of sheriff more about who controlled the money than who kept the peace. In many towns, the courthouse doubled as a backdrop for backroom bargains, judges persuaded with gold dust, saloon owners cutting deals with deputies, and ordinary settlers crushed under the weight of influence and intimidation. Wyatt, Earp, celebrated later as a frontier hero, intersected with this underbelly. Before the gunfight at the OK Corral, he was connected to brothel activity in boomtowns, at times accused of leveraging his power to muscle out rivals or enforce protection schemes. Meanwhile, Johnny Bean, the sheriff of Cochise County, stood at the center of a 10% ring, accumulating graft from vice industries and pushing political influence, to the point of collecting the same fees twice and being arrested though released on technicalities. The badge, in these cases, functioned less as a symbol of order and more as a key in a system of profit. Even ostensibly righteous lawmen like Frank Canton, one-time deputy U.S. Marshal, were tied to cattle barons, leading armed vigilante raids to eliminate homesteaders under false accusations of rustling. That blurred line between law and outlaw made true justice rare. Corruption didn't bend the system, it was the system. The myth of the honorable lawman evaporates when you realize many wore badges by day but dealt in shadow deals by night. The real rule of the Old West wasn't law and order itself, it was who held the purse strings and who could silence anyone bold enough to object. Number 2. The hidden violence of outlaws. Popular culture drapes Jesse James and Billy the Kid in romantic colors, but that gloss hides a raw, terrifying reality. Jesse James wasn't a Robin Hood who shared loot. He led a violent Confederate gang that struck trains and banks, robbing ordinary citizens as much as bankers, and leaving fear in their wake. His attacks went beyond stealing money, they shredded the illusion of safety for whole towns, casting a long shadow across the expanding frontier. The cloak of rebellion he wore was worn tight over graft and ruthless aggression. Billy the Kid's grin might look cheerful in photos, but his path was built on feuds where blood was currency. He didn't heroically stand against injustice, he moved through lethal alliances, switching sides when it served him, mounting a reputation that grew faster than any gunshot. And then there's John Wesley Hardin, whose brutality turned violence into art. Historians credit him with more than 20 to possibly over 40 killings. One notorious tale even claims he shot a man for snoring too loud, a detail so chilling that it outlives the myths. He reveled in the terror he inspired, killing not as a means to an end, but out of a raw desire for power. These weren't folk heroes, they were predators who ruled through fear. Entire families west of the Mississippi packed up and fled towns when their names surfaced on criminal lists. Life wasn't about law or revenge, it was about domination. Outlaw gangs weren't daring underdogs, they were instruments of chaos, thriving in a world where the line between survival and murder was paper-thin. Their legend grew fast and loud, fed by newspapers chasing sensational headlines. But behind every printed story lay real victims: ranchers left bankrupt, travelers stripped of life savings, witnesses who found safety only by disappearing into anonymity. Violence was both tool and trademark, more effective than any weapon because it cost nothing but carried everything. In the end, the Old West outlaw wasn't a symbol of freedom. He was a walking storm of terror, forced myth-making his only lasting legacy. Number 3. Cowboys and the Forgotten Dead. The myth of the cowboy celebrates open skies, endless freedom, and a rugged independence that became a symbol of the American frontier, but the truth was far harsher and far more forgotten. Life on cattle drives meant weeks of back-breaking labor, facing storms that could sweep across the plains without warning, nights spent soaked in freezing, and the ever-present threat of stampedes. Thousands of cattle weighing nearly 1,000 pounds each could crush riders beneath their hooves in seconds. Bandits waited along trails, and raiding gangs targeted herds that represented fortunes in beef. Many men never returned home, their bodies buried along remote routes, their names fading into obscurity. Disease haunted the trail as much as gunmen did. Dysentery from polluted water, pneumonia from cold nights, Infections from small cuts that turned deadly without medical help all claimed more cowboys than shootouts ever could. Even those who survived often came home broken by exhaustion or left behind on the trail, unable to keep pace. For all of this risk, their pay was meager. Ranching empires made enormous profits from the growing national hunger for beef, but the men who drove the herds earned barely enough to scrape by. The image of a cowboy as a free spirit masks the reality of a disposable workforce. The violence of the open range extended far beyond the hardships of drives. Range wars erupted when rival ranching interests collided, particularly as land became fenced off with new barbed wire. In places like Wyoming during the Johnson County War, wealthy cattle barons hired mercenaries and gunmen to hunt down small ranchers accused of rustling, many of them innocent settlers who were simply trying to survive. Farms were burned, livestock destroyed, families threatened, and blood spilled in disputes that were less about justice and more about monopoly over land and water. Violence became an accepted tool of business, and those caught in the middle rarely saw protection from lawmen, who were often aligned with the powerful. Another truth long hidden beneath the myth is the diversity of the men who rode the range. As many as a quarter of all cowboys were black, many of them freedmen who sought work after the Civil War. Mexican vaqueros had been herding cattle in the Southwest long before the cowboy became an American icon, and their techniques, from roping styles to saddle designs, defined the very culture of the West. Native Americans, too, worked as cowhands, scouts, and wranglers, though their roles were often erased from the story. Despite their skill and essential contributions, these men were largely excluded from the mythologized cowboy image and endured constant discrimination, both in life and in memory. Many of these cowboys lie in unmarked graves, buried near trails, ranches, or forgotten settlements. They left behind no monuments, no songs written in their honor, only the faint traces of a life spent in labor and danger. The cowboy dream was not a ballad sung beneath the stars but a reality of sweat, hardship, and death. The cost of feeding America's appetite for beef was measured in bodies, and those lives rarely found a place in the legends that followed. Number 4. Native betrayals and broken promises. Treaties meant to safeguard peace and land rights for native nations were often nothing more than tools of deception, crafted to buy time until settlers, gold, or railroads could claim what they desired most. Promises made by U.S. officials of safety, territory, autonomy were frequently erased as soon as pressure from expansion rose to fever pitch. Forced relocations became routine. Entire tribes marched across vast distances, watching their elders weaken and their children fall, starving or freezing under merciless conditions. Situations that echoed the Trail of Tears unfolded repeatedly in the West, though often silenced and disguised behind the veil of westward advancement. At Sand Creek, a peaceful village of Cheyenne and Arapaho was attacked by soldiers, their homes engulfed in flames and families massacred. Survivors endured not just the loss of loved ones but the erasure of memory, as rewritten accounts cast the massacre as a justified act against hostile tribes. Such brutal events were not exceptions, but part of a more widespread pattern where native people were depicted as nameless obstacles rather than fully human. Native scouts, often recruited to guide U.S. forces through unfamiliar terrain, were then abandoned or even targeted in turn, their loyalty repaid with betrayal. Frontier progress hinged not just on manifest destiny but on the systematic dismantling of cultures that had existed for centuries. Land seizure was accompanied by outlawing spiritual practices, blocking access to hunting or fishing grounds, and forcing assimilation through boarding schools intent on erasing language and identity. Sovereign nations were coerced into dependency through broken treaties, then punished when they resisted the loss of their land. Broken promises weren't just legal breaches, they were fractures in the survival of a people. Through textbooks, Wild West shows, and folklore, Native Americans became flat caricatures, noble savages or savage villains stripped of nuance, stripped of voice. Their suffering became part of a narrative that celebrated settlement while silencing the cost. Cultural erasure happened not only through violence but through omission. Erecting monuments to lawmen or cowboys was easier than acknowledging that the foundations of some towns came from stolen land stained with blood. In truth, the Old West was not a shining testament to freedom and opportunity. It was a graveyard for societies dismantled by greed and indifference, where betrayal followed every handshake, and the people who had called the West home for generations were pushed into shadows, forgotten even as they faded from life. Number 5. Towns of Sin and Shadows. Boomtowns glittered with the promise of sudden fortune, yet beneath the flashy facades lurked hardship, exploitation, and despair. As soon as prospectors arrived, gambling halls went up, often the grandest buildings in town, shaping the local economy. Their dice were frequently loaded, their games an easy mark to drain even a work's full day's pay. Brothels multiplied just as fast, filled with women, many immigrants or trafficked living brief, harsh lives under madams who guarded profits and survival alike. Saloons were far more than places to grab a drink. They were outposts of vice and crime, where whispered deals could seal robberies, murders, or smuggling operations. In larger settlements, opium dens pulled in men battling disappointment or addiction, while corrupt lawmen turned a blind eye, collecting bribes to keep the business alive. Justice, when it arrived, was brutal and arbitrary mob hangings in the square, no trial, no mercy. The gallows stood as stark reminders of a frontier where due process often gave way to vigilante action. These towns rose on greed but collapsed in silence, leaving behind dusty, abandoned buildings that echo with forgotten lives. The boom's end wasn't a slow fade, it was a sudden crash, as mines dried up, banks failed, and people simply disappeared. Ghost towns like Bodie or Virginia City, now photographed for nostalgia, were once theaters of human ruin, empty storefronts where dreams died behind boarded-up windows. Behind the veneer of the American dream, most people lost everything and paid dearly in ways that history often ignores. Those dirt-floored saloons held stories of broken families, ruined men, exploited women, and children left parentless. The gallows weren't spectacle, they were the tool of fear that held fragile order in place. Boomtowns weren't hopeful outposts, they were flashpoints of desperation, where progress masked cruelty, and survival meant embracing darkness at every turn. Number 6. Myths that covered the darkness. Hollywood took the Old West and polished it into a story of brave sheriffs, noble settlers, and heroic duels, but the reality was far less glamorous. The idea of a dramatic showdown at high noon, with two gunmen facing off in silence before a quick draw, is almost entirely a myth. Real gunfights were sudden, chaotic, often fueled by alcohol, and more likely to happen in an alley, a saloon, or during an ambush than in a staged duel in the middle of town. The so-called wild towns were not lawless either. Many of them, including Dodge City, Deadwood, and Tombstone, enforced strict gun ordinances, requiring visitors to surrender their weapons before entering. The cinematic version of unbridled freedom was, in reality, a carefully regulated environment where firearms were tightly controlled. The cowboy myth was also carefully constructed. While the cowboy became a symbol of white rugged individualism, the truth is that a significant portion of cattle hands were black freedmen, Mexican vaqueros, and Native Americans. Their skills, traditions, and resilience shaped cowboy culture, yet they were erased from the legend to create a cleaner narrative that fit a national identity. The cowboy was less a gunslinging hero and more an underpaid laborer enduring exhausting cattle drives for little reward, exposed to disease, storms, and violence. Their lives were hard, short, and often forgotten, but their image was reinvented as a national icon stripped of its complexity. The outlaw legends were equally exaggerated. Dime novels and early newspapers turned figures like Billy the Kid and Jesse James into folk heroes or villains, depending on the story being sold. These tales inflated body counts, dramatized robberies, and turned brutal killers into characters fit for entertainment. Wyatt Earp, remembered today as one of the most famous lawmen of the West, only became a heroic figure decades after his death, when a romanticized biography transformed him into a larger-than-life character. The messy truth that lawmen were often corrupt, shifting between upholding order and exploiting their authority, was replaced by a neat tale of good versus evil. Other myths glossed over tragedy. The gold rush is remembered as an age of bold pioneers seeking fortune, but behind that image lay mass starvation, collapsed mines, deadly fevers, and graveyards filled with men who never struck it rich. Native American suffering was rewritten as destiny, their destruction framed as an unavoidable step in the march of progress rather than the outcome of deliberate campaigns of displacement and violence. Even the concept of manifest destiny itself was used as justification to turn atrocities into inevitabilities. These myths were not harmless exaggerations. They served a cultural purpose, creating a romantic narrative that Americans could embrace, one that hid exploitation, corruption, and genocide beneath stories of grit and heroism. They provided a national identity rooted in courage and independence while burying the darker truths of survival, greed, and power struggles. The Old West that lingers in memory today is less about how it really was and more about how a nation wanted to see itself, not through the smoke and blood of its past, but through the polished lens of legend.